For decades, he was the most feared man in Iraq. He ruled with an iron fist, defied the United States, and survived wars, attacks, and conspiracies. But everything changed when his regime fell. From then on, a relentless hunt began that took him from the gilded palaces to the darkest corners of the country. Captured by US forces, locked in a windowless cell, and tried for crimes against humanity, Saddam Hussein faced a trial that blended justice, revenge, and political theater. His days passed between interrogations, prayers, and a routine controlled down to the smallest detail. No one knew when the end would come, but everyone knew it would come. What happened in his final hours? How did the dictator, who never showed remorse, behave in the face of death? And why did his execution, instead of healing a national wound, leave it even more raw?
The Hunt for the Dictator, Operation Red Dawn.
The 9th of April 2003. The bronze statue of Saddam Hussein collapses in Baghdad's Firdos Square. 24 years of absolute power collapse in a cloud of dust and twisted metal. But as the world watches this symbolic moment, the dictator himself fades into the Iraqi shadows, beginning what would become the most intense manhunt in modern military history. The fallen regime leaves behind a labyrinth of loyalties that transcends political structures. In the tribal heartland of central Iraq, Saddam finds refuge among networks forged over decades of calculated patronage. The Sunni Triangle becomes his sanctuary, particularly around Tikrit, where clan alliances run deeper than any occupying force can penetrate. For 8 months, US intelligence agencies deployed unprecedented resources. CIA operatives, military analysts, and local informants wove a surveillance network that stretched from the banks of the Tigris to the deserts of Anbar. Each arrest yielded fragments of information. Each interrogation revealed patterns of movement that gradually built up a map of the Ba'athist underground. Salah al-Din province emerges as the epicenter of the search. In dusty villages like Ad, Dor, and Samara, where sun-baked faces hide tribal secrets, Saddam moves between safe houses with the precision of a ghost. He is not simply a fugitive, he is a living symbol of resistance for those who regard the invasion as a national humiliation. The intelligence services understand that they are not merely tracking a man, but dismantling a culture of silence built on ancestral loyalties and awe. Every farm inspected, every cellar searched, reveals the complexity of a society where protecting a fallen leader is an act of tribal honor. Decisive information comes from the most unexpected source, a captured bodyguard whose identity remains classified to this day. Under psychological, not physical pressure, he reveals that the former president is hiding on a rural property near Ad-Daw. The betrayal stems not from money or threats, but from exhaustion and the realization that the cause is lost. The 13th of December 2003. Operation Red Dawn takes its name from an American film about armed resistance, but its execution is pure military precision. 600 soldiers from the 4th Infantry Division converge on 2 targets designated Wolverine 1 and Wolverine 2. They are anonymous farms in the Mesopotamian landscape, indistinguishable from thousands of other rural properties. Hawk helicopters slice through the night air as armored vehicles surround the structures. There is no armed resistance, no cinematic gun battles, just the metallic sound of boots on dry ground and the hum of radio communications. In Wolverine 2, a soldier notices a poorly concealed mound of dirt. Beneath uneven bricks and dirty carpet, they discover a metal lid. Upon opening it, their flashlights reveal a vertical cavity 2 meters deep, a makeshift shelter with no ventilation or amenities. Inside is an unrecognizable man. He has a scruffy grey beard, long tangled hair, and wrinkled clothes that reek of prolonged confinement. He carries a Glock pistol he never draws and a suitcase containing $750,000. The eyes that once intimidated ministers and generals now flicker in the artificial light, blurred by months of underground darkness. He doesn't bark orders. He doesn't threaten retaliation. His first statement is almost a whisper. I am Saddam Hussein, President of Iraq, and I am ready to negotiate. Even in the most absolute defeat, He maintains the illusion of political authority. The impact on the soldiers is immediate but restrained. No one celebrates. The moment has a gravity that transcends military victory. They have captured the most wanted man on the planet, but they have also witnessed human fragility in its rawest form. One of the commandos describes the scene as surreal. It was like meeting a hermit who insisted on being king. Another soldier notes his long fingernails and trembling hands. The dictator who ordered the deaths of hundreds of thousands is reduced to a frightened old man in a hole. Upon being handcuffed, Saddam asks if the soldiers are American. When he receives confirmation, he simply nods. His face reflects not terror, but rather a strange resignation, as if he had known this moment would inevitably come. The helicopter transfer takes place in absolute silence. Saddam stares fixedly at the metal floor, while Baghdad stretches out beneath the rotor blades. The city he once controlled with an iron fist is now definitively out of his reach. Within hours, images of his military medical examination circulated around the world. A soldier inspected his mouth with latex gloves while cameras documented every detail. It was the most humiliating image possible for a dictator, reduced to an object of inspection, defenseless against medical and media scrutiny. Paul Bremer, the US administrator of Iraq, appears before the cameras with a statement that resonates globally. "Ladies and gentlemen, we got him." 4 words that mark the end of an era and the beginning of questions about the future of a fractured nation. The capture marks the end of an era. The former Iraqi president is now simply high-value detainee Hussein.
Total isolation, the prison of Camp Cropper.
The lights never go out in Saddam Hussein's cell. The Camp Cropper complex, located near Baghdad International Airport, is a facility that doesn't appear on public maps or official records. Between reinforced concrete walls and watchtowers, the former president of Iraq begins a new life marked by the most absolute isolation imaginable in the US military prison system. The cell measures 2 meters by 3. It contains a metal cot with a thin mattress, a steel toilet, a tiny sink, and a fluorescent lamp that projects a constant, relentless light. The message is clear. There is no privacy, no rest, no moment when surveillance slackens its intensity. High-definition cameras record every movement, every gesture, every facial expression. Saddam receives the official high-value code, detainee Hussein, but to the soldiers of the Super 12 unit guarding him, he is simply the old man. For the first few weeks, his behavior oscillates between arrogance and confusion. He demands to be addressed as head of state, insists on maintaining presidential protocols, and constantly refers to himself as the legitimate ruler of Iraq. The daily routine is established with military precision. Saddam wakes before dawn, performs ritual ablutions in the small wash basin, and begins his morning prayers. His voice, once powerful in speeches that mobilized crowds, now fades to a murmur barely audible between the concrete walls. The guards learn to recognize the rhythm of his prayers as the first marker of each day's time. An hour of daily exercise in the yard is his only contact with the outside world. In a fenced, 20-square-meter space, he walks in methodical circles while armed soldiers watch from high towers. There is no conversation, no interaction, just the sound of his footsteps on gravel and the distant murmur of air traffic from the nearby airport. During these walks, some guards observe details that reveal the prisoner's psychological complexity. Saddam constantly studies the sky, as if assessing weather patterns or flight paths. Occasionally, he stops and remains motionless for minutes, staring blankly at the horizon. These are moments when the mask of political power fades and the fragility of a man uprooted from any familiar context emerges. The personal library he is allowed to keep consists of religious texts in Arabic and several volumes of classical poetry. He spends hours reading and rereading the same pages, making marginal notes in careful calligraphy. His writings are divided between letters addressed to his daughters in exile in Jordan and personal reflections that he never shares with his jailers. FBI Special Agent George Pirro becomes his most constant interlocutor. During sessions that stretch over months, Pirro develops an approach based on formal respect and patience. There is no direct pressure or aggressive interrogation. Instead, he builds a relationship of feigned trust that allows Saddam to express his perceptions of power, history, and his own legacy. In these conversations, a contradictory personality emerges. Saddam oscillates between moments of political lucidity and bursts of narcissistic grandiloquence. He justifies each repressive decision as necessary for national stability. He describes massacres as surgical operations to extirpate subversive elements. His discourse reveals a mind that has reconfigured moral reality to eliminate any trace of personal guilt. Particularly revealing is his analysis of weapons of mass destruction. He admits that Iraq had destroyed them after the Gulf War, but maintains strategic ambiguity to deter Iran. This admission exposes the vanity that led to his downfall, preferring the perception of power to the reality of political survival. The guards at Super 12 develop a complex relationship with their prisoner. After months of forced coexistence, some begin to perceive unexpected human aspects. Saddam shows genuine curiosity about their personal lives, asks questions about their families, and occasionally offers fatherly advice on leadership and discipline. However, these moments of apparent humanity contrast dramatically with his complete lack of remorse for his crimes. His correspondence with his daughters becomes his primary emotional connection to the outside world. The letters reveal a nostalgic father clinging to memories of a family life that his own authoritarian regime had distorted. He advises them to maintain the dignity of their lineage, preserve the memory of their dead siblings, and never give in to the pressures of exile. As the months pass, isolation begins to take its psychological toll. Saddam develops obsessive habits, organizing his belongings with mathematical precision, counting steps during his walks, and memorizing entire passages from the Quran. These behaviors reveal a mind struggling to maintain control over an environment that has reduced his existence to minimal routines. Moments of crisis emerge without warning. Episodes where he remains motionless for hours, staring at a wall in absolute silence. Other days he experiences bursts of suppressed rage. He paces the cell, mutters names from his past, and gesticulates as if he were addressing an invisible audience. The paradox of his situation is reflected in his relationship with time. The man who once controlled the destinies of millions now lives in a perpetual present where each day is identical to the last. There are no projects to plan, decisions to make, or subordinates to direct. Only the endless repetition of basic survival routines. His guards notice that he frequently talks to himself, mentioning the names of former collaborators and relatives. Uday, Qusay, Barzan, Taha Yassin, Ramadan. The names emerge in fragmented monologues that suggest a mind constantly revisiting the decisions that led to its downfall. During the final stages of his imprisonment, Saddam develops a strange serenity. He no longer speaks of returning to power. Instead, he focuses on constructing a heroic narrative of his own resistance. He presents himself as the last defender of Iraqi sovereignty, a martyr misunderstood by an era that doesn't understand historical greatness.
The trial of the century, the Iraqi Special Tribunal and the Dujai case.
The courtroom emerges from the chaos as an improvised theater of justice. Inside Baghdad's green zone, surrounded by concrete walls and barbed wire, a judicial compound is being built that aspires to be the stage where a traumatized nation confronts its darkest past. The Iraqi Special Tribunal represents an unprecedented legal challenge, trying a dictator for mass crimes, while the country he once ruled bleeds to death in sectarian insurgency. On the 19th of October 2005, television cameras captured the moment Saddam Hussein entered the dock. He wore an impeccable dark suit, a beard trimmed with military precision, and a defiant expression that turned every hearing into a political confrontation. His first statement set the tone for the entire proceedings. He refused to recognize the legitimacy of the tribunal and demanded to be treated as the constitutional president of Iraq. The choice of the Dujai case as the first trial reflects both legal expediency and political calculation. In June 1982, this small Shia village north of Baghdad was the scene of a failed assassination attempt on Saddam Hussein's life. The ensuing retaliation was disproportionate even by the standards of his regime. 148 men and teenagers were executed, hundreds of families deported, homes demolished and orchards destroyed. Dujail was erased from the map as a collective warning. Prosecutors have irrefutable evidence. Official documents signed by Saddam Hussein authorizing the executions, Mukhabarat files detailing arrests and torture, and survivor testimony. It's a case that can be proven beyond a reasonable doubt, unlike more massive but complex crimes like the Kurdish genocide in Halabja. The tribunal is composed of Iraqi judges, many of whom spent years under Ba'athist terror. Its initial president, Rizgar Mohammed Amin, is a Kurdish jurist who attempts to maintain procedural dignity despite extreme political pressure. However, Saddam's constant interruptions, threats from insurgents, and government criticism led him to resign in January 2006. His replacement, Rauf Abdelrahman, adopts a more authoritarian approach. He tolerates fewer interruptions and maintains strict control over the hearings. This shift transforms the dynamics of the trial. From a legal dialogue punctuated by political theatrics, it evolves into a more rigid process where the defendant's voice is progressively reduced. Saddam turns every session into a political platform. He interrupts prosecutors and witnesses, addresses the cameras directly, and delivers nationalist speeches that resonate with Sunni groups. His strategy doesn't seek legal absolution, but rather the construction of a political myth. He presents himself as the victim of an imperialist and sectarian conspiracy, the last defender of an Iraq that no longer exists. Dujail survivors constitute the most devastating moments of the trial. Men arrested as teenagers describe systematic torture, hanging by the wrists, electric shocks, and rape. Women describe watching their homes demolished while desperately searching for missing children and husbands. A particularly poignant account comes from a man arrested at the age of 14. He describes being hung by his wrists for hours while listening to his mother's screams from an adjacent cell. When his torturer asked him if he still opposed the president, he replied that he just wanted to go back to school. The response was more beatings. The documents reveal the bureaucratic methodology of terror: mass arrest warrants, execution lists, ammunition invoices. The state apparatus turned murder into an administrative routine. Saddam doesn't deny the authenticity of the documents bearing his signature. Instead, he justifies each decision under the doctrine of national security. He claims the residents of Dujail were armed terrorists financed by Iran. He describes the executions as legitimate acts of state self-defense. His logic is implacable. A president has a constitutional duty to eliminate internal threats. The defense, led by Khalil al-Dulaimi, attempts to argue that the reprisals were a proportional response to an armed attack. They cite Iraqi legal precedents that authorized capital punishment for treason. However, the massive response, the lack of individual trials, and the collective nature of the punishment systematically undermine this strategy. The trial unfolds in an atmosphere of increasing violence. Several defense attorneys are murdered outside the courtroom, creating a climate of intimidation that affects public perception of the trial. Saddam uses each incident to reinforce his narrative of victimization, presenting himself as the target of a persecution that violates fundamental principles of justice. The hearings reflect the sectarian divisions tearing the country apart. For Shiite and Kurdish communities, the trial represents a historic opportunity to hold the oppressor accountable. For Sunni sectors, especially in tribal regions, Saddam maintains his status as a legitimate leader, the victim of sectarian revenge orchestrated by foreign occupiers. One of the most dramatic moments occurs when Saddam, interrupting the prosecutor, stands up and shouts, "I am the president of Iraq, and I have the right to defend my people." His voice echoes in the courtroom as the guards approach. He is led away amid protests, but the moment is broadcast live and becomes a symbol of his defiant resistance. The judges face multiple pressures: threats from insurgents, criticism from international organizations for procedural irregularities, and government pressure to expedite the verdict. Several resign for security reasons. Others are transferred after receiving direct threats. The court operates under a state of siege that compromises its image of judicial impartiality. As the case progresses, a legal paradox emerges. The trial aims to establish principles of the rule of law in a country where the law has disintegrated. Institutional justice is sought in the midst of a civil war that has made revenge a social norm. The contradiction is evident, using judicial procedures to prosecute crimes in a context where extrajudicial violence has become endemic. The presentation of forensic evidence adds a scientific dimension to the horror. Exhumations of mass graves reveal remains of victims with signs of torture, multiple fractures, bullet holes in the back of the head, evidence of restraints. Experts reconstruct execution methods that reveal systematic planning, not impulsive acts of retaliation. When the verdict is announced for the 5th of November 2006, tensions in Baghdad reach critical levels. Security forces reinforce positions in sensitive neighborhoods. Hospitals prepare for riot victims. The capital becomes a besieged city awaiting the moment that will define the future of Iraqi transitional justice. On the day of the verdict, Saddam enters the courtroom with the same defiant composure he has maintained throughout the trial. When Judge Abdelrahman reads the death sentence, the former dictator remains standing, showing no fear or surprise. His response is immediate and predictable. "Long live Iraq! Down with the traitors!" It is his last public statement as a free man. In a few months, those words will echo again in a death row, but in circumstances that will reveal that justice, mishandled, can turn into revenge that perpetuates the cycles of violence it was intended to break.
The final sentence, countdown to the gallows.
The 5th of November 2006. The Baghdad morning dawns with the weight of history. In the capital's neighborhoods, the streets gradually empty as millions of Iraqis prepare to witness the moment that will define their collective future. Inside the courtroom, television cameras capture every gesture as the judges enter to deliver the most anticipated verdict in the country's modern history. Saddam stands in the dock, his posture erect and his gaze defiant, as if receiving military honors. When Judge Rauf Abdelrahman begins to read the sentence, his voice resonating with bureaucratic solemnity that contrasts dramatically with the emotional charge of the moment. Guilty of crimes against humanity, sentenced to death by hanging. The words fall like hammer blows in the absolute silence of the courtroom. Saddam receives the verdict without flinching. There are no pleas or tears. Instead, he raises his right fist and utters the words that will resonate in the collective Iraqi memory. "God is great. Long live Iraq. Down with the traitors." His voice retains the authority he wielded for decades, as if the death sentence were simply another decree he must proclaim with presidential dignity. The national reaction is instantaneous and deeply sectarian. In Sadr city and the predominantly Shia southern provinces, spontaneous celebrations erupt. Shots are fired in the air, cheers are held, and street processions celebrate the verdict as divine justice after decades of oppression. The faces of elderly Shia reflect a satisfaction that transcends personal revenge. It is the official recognition of their historical suffering. Simultaneously, in Tikrit and Anbar province, Sunni strongholds, the verdict sparked protests and collective mourning. Demonstrations where Saddam's portraits were raised as flags of resistance. For these sectors, the verdict represents not justice but sectarian humiliation orchestrated by foreign occupiers and Shiite collaborators. The national division deepens with every television image. The defense team, led by Khalil al-Dulaimi, immediately filed an appeal with the Iraqi Court of Cassation. The document, over 200 pages long, questions not only procedural aspects but also the constitutional legitimacy of the court itself. They argue that the Iraqi Special Tribunal was created during the US occupation and lacks the legal authority to judge acts committed by the previous constitutional government. The appeal raises complex legal issues that reveal the contradictions of the process. Can a tribunal established by occupying authorities try crimes committed by the previous sovereign government? Do the events in Du Jail constitute crimes against humanity or legitimate acts of state action against armed insurgents? Did the trial meet international due process standards? However, legal considerations are overshadowed by political dynamics. Nouri al-Maliki's government, dominated by Shia parties, is unwilling to allow lengthy reviews that could undermine its legitimacy among electoral constituencies demanding immediate justice. Popular Shia pressure for swift execution overrides any concerns about legal refinements. The Court of Cassation operates under multiple pressures: threats from insurgents, government expectations, international scrutiny, and the tacit understanding that its decision will influence the future of national stability. Judges review files under military protection in secret facilities, isolated from public opinion but aware of their political implications. The 26th of December 2006. Less than 2 months after the original verdict, the Court of Cassation upheld the death sentence. The decision was unanimous and final. In a sober statement, the High Court stated that the documentary evidence was irrefutable and that Dujail's crimes constituted clear violations of international humanitarian law. The confirmation of the sentence triggers the most dramatic legal chronometer in modern Iraqi history. Under current law, executions must be carried out within 30 days of the Court of Cassation's confirmation. But the Maliki government does not plan to wait the full deadline. The proximity of Eid al-Adha, the Islamic holiday that begins on the 31st of December 2006, creates a window of political opportunity. The decision to execute Saddam before Eid immediately sparked controversy, even among government allies. Moderate Shiite clerics warn that executing a prisoner on the eve of a religious holiday could be perceived as desecration. European diplomats express concern about the hasty process. However, Maliki remains determined. Justice cannot wait for religious calendars. Logistical preparations begin immediately. The Military Intelligence Center in Kadimia, a Shiite district in northern Baghdad, is selected as the execution site. The choice is not accidental. The very building where Saddam's repressive apparatus operated for years will become the scene of his death. The symbolism is deliberate, and the irony is evident. The construction of the gallows requires absolute discretion. Military carpenters work through the night to install the wooden platform and the execution mechanism. Technical tests are performed to ensure that the fall is sufficient to cause instant death by cervical fracture. Every detail is meticulously reviewed to avoid complications that could turn the execution into a macabre spectacle. The selection of witnesses reflects the political complexity of the moment. 3 judges from the special court represent judicial authority. Justice Ministry officials provide governmental legitimacy. Islamic clerics provide religious sanction. More controversially, survivors from Dujail are invited, turning the execution into an act of symbolic reparation for the victims. The United States maintains a carefully calibrated, ambivalent position. Although it had captured and held Saddam for 3 years, it insists that the execution must be a purely Iraqi act. US troops will transport the condemned man to the gates of the execution center, but will not enter the premises. Saddam Hussein's death must bear an exclusively Iraqi signature. The international reaction is predictably divided. The Vatican expresses profound sadness and reiterates its doctrinal opposition to the death penalty. The European Union regrets the decision to execute rather than imprison life, questioning respect for international procedural standards. Human rights organizations denounce the hasty process and warn of irregularities that compromise the legitimacy of the verdict. Meanwhile, in Amman, Saddam's daughters Ragad and Rana are mobilizing diplomatic resources to stop the execution. They are sending urgent letters to the Iraqi government, the International Red Cross, and various Arab foreign ministries. Their arguments are both legal and emotional. The trial was politicized, there are other pending cases, and the execution before Eid constitutes religious desecration. However, these efforts fall on deaf ears in Baghdad. The Maliki government has made an irrevocable political decision. Saddam's execution before Eid will send an unequivocal message. The new Iraq has the power to definitively close the Ba'athist chapter. There will be no clemency or further delay. During the final days of December, security in Baghdad was dramatically intensified. Major roads were blocked, commercial flights were restricted, and communications were monitored. The government feared last-minute violent reactions from Sunni insurgents. Emergency protocols were activated in hospitals and police stations. The tension is palpable in every neighborhood of the capital. In Shia areas, there is almost festive anticipation. Families gather around televisions awaiting official confirmation. In Sunni neighborhoods, a dense silence prevails, filled with resentment and fear. The city is polarized between those who await justice and those who anticipate sectarian humiliation. The 29th of December 2006. In his cell at Camp Cropper, Saddam Hussein is officially informed that his appeal has been rejected and that he will be executed at dawn the following day. He receives the news with the same stoic serenity he has maintained throughout the trial. There are no cries or pleas, only a silent acceptance of the fate he had foreseen from the moment of his capture. The final administrative arrangements are completed with bureaucratic efficiency. Transfer documents are signed by US and Iraqi officials. Security protocols are reviewed for the final time. The clock of modern Iraqi history ticks down as a divided nation prepares to witness the final end of the Saddam Hussein era. The countdown to the gallows has begun, and with it approaches a moment that will forever alter the collective memory of a society traumatized by decades of dictatorship and years of civil war.
The last night, rituals and farewells before the execution.
The 29th of December 2006, 11:47 p.m. The silence at Camp Cropper is thicker than on previous nights. The soldiers of the Super 12 unit have been officially informed. Tomorrow they will hand over their most valuable prisoner for execution. For nearly 3 years, they have shared daily routines with the man who once terrorized millions. Now they must prepare to say goodbye to the old man who reads the Quran in a low voice and asks about their families. 3 a.m. on December 30. First Lieutenant Andre Jackson enters the cell accompanied by his usual interpreter. The fluorescent lighting casts harsh shadows on the concrete walls as Jackson utters the words they have rehearsed mentally for days. It is time. You must prepare for your execution, which will take place in a few hours. Saddam sits up slowly from his cot. Like an old man awakening from a deep sleep, his response is immediate and calm. I've been sentenced before. There is no dramatic indignation or desperate pleading. It is the reaction of a man who has ruled with life and death decisions, and who now accepts his own verdict with the same coldness with which he ordered others. The preparation ritual begins immediately. Saddam goes to the small metal basin and performs complete ablutions, the Islamic ritual washing prior to transcendental moments. His movements are methodical, almost ceremonial. He washes his face, hands, and feet with the precision of someone who has repeated these gestures for decades. For him, it is not simply personal hygiene, but spiritual purification before the encounter with death. His choice of attire reveals his concern for the final image he will project to history. He carefully reviews his small wardrobe and chooses one of his best dark suits, a crisp white shirt, and a sober yet elegant black coat. Each garment is carefully smoothed. Even in these final moments, he maintains the vanity that characterized his public life. A seemingly trivial scene takes on emotional significance when Saddam can't find a pair of socks. He asks the soldiers for help, and they search through his belongings until they find the ones he deems appropriate. During these minutes, he asks his guards if they slept well and thanks them for their hospitality. Humanity unexpectedly emerges in exchanges that reveal bonds formed over years of forced coexistence. The soldier finally accepts, understanding that this gesture eases the tension of the moment for both of them. For Saddam, it represents a final act of generosity that reaffirms his humanity. For the guard, it becomes an emotional burden he will carry for years. The final gift from a dictator who showed personal kindness despite his historical crimes. Saddam then sits down on his cot and begins to write. Over the next half hour, he composes a letter addressed to his family, especially to his daughters exiled in Jordan. His words are carefully chosen. He asks them for strength and dignity, reminds them of the pride of their lineage, and asks them to preserve the memory of their dead brothers. There are no apologies or expressions of regret, only paternal instructions on how to maintain the family honor despite the circumstances. The letter also includes specific provisions regarding his funeral. He requests to be buried in Al-Awiya, his home village, alongside Uday and Qusay. He asks that the ceremony be simple but dignified, without political ostentation that could fuel further violence. These are the final decisions of a man who for decades controlled every detail of state power, now reduced to planning his own burial. 4 a.m. The members of the Super 12 gather in front of the cell, dressed in full combat gear. It's a surreal moment. Soldiers armed to the teeth preparing for a mission that doesn't require violence, but rather accompanies an elderly man in his final steps. The tension is palpable, not because of physical danger, but because of the emotional weight of the moment. When Saddam sees them, he walks toward the bars with his posture erect and his dignity preserved. He extends his hand to each soldier individually, looking them directly in the eyes. "You have been more family to me than any Iraqi," he tells them in a firm but emotional voice. The phrase encapsulates the paradox of his situation. Finding humanity in his foreign jailers while preparing to be executed by his own countrymen. Several soldiers would later confess to experiencing conflicting emotions at that moment. They knew Saddam had ordered mass torture and devastating wars, but the man before them displayed genuine vulnerability and gratitude. It was impossible not to be moved by the emerging humanity of someone who had embodied political brutality for decades. The tears Saddam shed are the first his guards have seen since his capture. They are not tears of fear, but of farewell. He weeps for the life that is ending, for the children he lost, for the country he believes he defended according to his convictions. In these final moments, the implacable dictator reveals himself as a father and an old man, facing death with imperfect but genuine dignity. 4:45 a.m. The military convoy arrives at Camp Cropper. Armored vehicles and helicopters wait under the still night Baghdad sky. Saddam is handcuffed behind his back, but walks unresistingly toward his final transport. He carries only the Quran, which he has been reading during his final hours. During the flight to the execution center, Baghdad stretches out beneath the helicopter's blades, a reminder of everything he once controlled. The lights of the city he ruled for nearly a quarter of a century gradually fade as the aircraft heads toward Kademia. Saddam remains absolutely silent, his gaze fixed on his handcuffed hands. The final journey in an armored vehicle takes place through the empty streets of a tense capital. It passes near the Tigris River, the presidential palace where he once issued death orders, and the neighborhoods he has known since his political youth. It is an involuntary journey through the geography of his lost power, en route to the same building where for years he ordered interrogations and executions. Upon his arrival at the Military Intelligence Center, now renamed Camp Justice, he is greeted by Justice Ministry officials, Islamic clerics, judges, and jail survivors. The presence of these victims closes a circle that began with his brutal retaliation in 1982. 24 years later, some of those who survived his revenge will witness his death. The last few minutes in the transport vehicle represent the final transition between the prisoner's private life and the public act of execution. Saddam has completed his personal farewell rituals. He has written his last words, handed over his possessions, and thanked those who guarded him. Now he must face the moment for which all his psychological preparation has been a rehearsal. To die as he believes a head of state should die, with public dignity despite the inherent humiliation of the gallows.
The execution of a dictator, the hanging of Saddam Hussein.
5 a.m., the 30th of December, 2006. In a rectangular room built inside a former military depot, the final minutes of the Saddam Hussein era are about to unfold before a carefully selected audience. The Kademia Intelligence Center, now known as Camp Justice, houses within its unpainted concrete walls the gallows that will definitively close the bloodiest chapter in modern Iraqi history. That austere, symbol-free, and adorned space becomes, for a few minutes, the most significant place in the country, where the weight of justice, the thirst for revenge, and the desire to close a cycle of horror converge. The legal transfer of custody is formalized with the signing of documents converting Saddam from an American prisoner to a condemned Iraqi. Maafa al-Rubai, the National Security Advisor, officially receives the man who once controlled every aspect of life in Iraq. The irony is not lost on him. Al-Rubai is a member of the Dawa Party, the same Shia organization that attempted to assassinate Saddam at jail 24 years earlier. Now, power has changed hands. But the historical resentment still smolders, heavy with memories and unfinished business. The execution room is occupied by approximately 30 people. 3 judges from the special court represent the judicial authority. Officials from the Ministry of Justice provide governmental legitimacy. Islamic clerics provide religious sanction. A forensic doctor waits to confirm the death. The executioner, his face covered, stands next to the gallows, technically rigged to cause instant death by cervical fracture. Everyone takes their places, aware that they will witness a moment that will mark the country's modern history and that their actions will be recorded, although not everyone expected what happened there to be so far removed from protocol. Among the most significant witnesses are survivors of Dujail, men who were tortured as teenagers and who now, as trauma-scarred adults, witness the death of the man who ordered their suffering. Their faces reflect a mixture of satisfaction, sadness, and emptiness that only victims of mass crimes can fully understand. For them, this is not just a judicial act, but the healing of a wound that has festered for decades. Saddam enters the room with a firm stride, requiring no assistance. He wears his dark suit, carefully selected during his final hours, a black coat that gives him a solemn appearance, and his hands are tied behind his back. His posture is erect, his chin raised, his gaze sweeping the room with the residual authority of someone who once instilled terror with his mere presence. He doesn't salute. He doesn't hesitate. He doesn't seek mercy. He presents himself as an intact figure in the face of death. Upon reaching the base of the gallows, one of the judges formally reads the final sentence. Saddam listens silently, occasionally nodding as if approving of the procedural propriety of the act. When offered a final word, he briefly declines. There are no grandiloquent speeches or political proclamations, only the quiet dignity of one who has accepted his fate. The climb up the 13 wooden steps proceeds without incident. Saddam requires no physical assistance and shows no hesitation. Each step resonates in the absolute silence of the courtroom, marking the rhythm of an improvised funeral march. Upon reaching the top platform, he stands directly in front of the executioner with the same composure he maintained during court hearings. It is a restrained, measured moment, yet charged with symbolic tension. Everyone is watching. No one breathes. The executioner offers him a black hood, part of the standard protocol for executions. Saddam flatly refuses. "I don't need that." He wants to face death with his eyes open, looking directly at those witnessing his end. It's a gesture that combines personal dignity with political theater, maintaining control over his image until the very end. As the executioner tightens the noose around his neck, a Shia cleric approaches to whisper the final Islamic prayers. Saddam begins to recite the Shahada, the Muslim declaration of faith. Ashhadu an la ilaha illa Allah. His voice is clear and firm, as if he were leading a collective prayer rather than preparing to die. That reverent intonation contrasts with the growing murmur that takes over the back of the room. It is at this point that the decorum of the execution completely disintegrates. From the lower part of the courtroom, several witnesses, Shia officials and survivors of Dujail begin shouting sectarian slogans, "Muqtada! Muqtada! Muqtada!" The name of the radical cleric Muqtada al-Sadr, whose father was murdered on Saddam's orders, resounds like a rallying cry that turns the judicial execution into an act of tribal revenge. Other witnesses join the chorus with cries of "To hell!" and "Long live Dujail!" The courtroom transforms into an emotional lynching scene that contradicts the solemnity that should characterize an act of state justice. The execution, planned as a demonstration of the rule of law, reveals itself to be an expression of barely contained sectarian hatred. Saddam is unfazed by hostility. He smiles slightly and responds with controlled calm. Is that bravery? His rhetorical question reveals contempt for those who find it necessary to humiliate him in his final moments. For him, personal dignity transcends external circumstances, even when those circumstances include the immediate proximity of death. Ignoring the chaos at his feet, Saddam restarts reciting the Shahada. Ashhadu an la ilaha illa Allah, wa ashhadu anna Muhammad Rasul Allah. His voice remains firmly devotional despite the shouts that try to interrupt him. It is his last affirmation of faith, and simultaneously his last act of defiance against those who seek to break his final composure. The scene is tense, chaotic, and deeply symbolic. It is not possible to complete the declaration of faith. 6 a.m. The trapdoor suddenly opens. Saddam Hussein's body falls into the void with brutal violence. The rope instantly tightens. The sharp impact of the hanging resonates in the room like the final shot of a decades-long war. His neck fractures instantly, causing immediate death, as later confirmed by a forensic medical examination. The body remains suspended for several minutes, swaying slightly, as the doctor approaches with a stethoscope to confirm the absence of vital signs. This is part of the legal protocol designed to avoid errors that could require a repeat of the procedure. Saddam Hussein's death is officially certified at 6:05 a.m. The confirmation is made with surgical coldness, without expression or ceremony. Just the coroner's slight nod and the signature on a certificate that summarizes the end of a life marked by excessive control. Almost immediately, a cell phone begins recording. One of the witnesses, strictly violating confidentiality rules, films the final moments and the sectarian shouts that accompanied the execution. This video is leaked a few hours later, circulating globally and transforming public perception of the event. What was supposed to be a solemn and restrained act becomes a viral piece that exposes the brutality of the scene. The footage reveals not only the execution itself, but also the hate-filled atmosphere, the cross insults, and the lack of emotional restraint of those present. The moving images show not a sober judicial execution, but a scene of sectarian revenge where government officials act as a lynch mob. The dignity the Iraqi government sought to project evaporates in the face of visual evidence that state justice has been contaminated by tribal and religious hatreds. The staging, planned for months, crumbles in seconds. What was intended to be the founding act of a new democratic Iraq becomes, for many, an unequivocal sign that old resentments continue to dictate the country's destiny. The international reaction is overwhelmingly critical. The Vatican expresses profound sadness. The European Union denounces lack of respect for human dignity, and Amnesty International describes the scene as a judicial lynching. Global media outlets reproduce pixelated and commented fragments of the video, which eventually replace official statements. The institutions that had supported the democratic transition face a moral dilemma: how to justify an execution that ended with insults and clandestine recordings. Even governments that supported the trial express concern about the sectarian theatrics. British Prime Minister Tony Blair declares that, although Saddam deserved punishment for his crimes, the manner of the execution does not honor the democratic values we claim to defend. The Bush administration remains publicly cautious, stating only that Iraqi justice has taken its course. Privately, however, multiple officials expressed discomfort with the handling of the end of the most iconic trial of the century. 6:30 a.m. The body is taken down from the gallows and placed on a military stretcher. The rope is removed and the face is covered with a white sheet. A second medical examination confirms the cervical fracture that caused instant death. The bureaucratic certification procedures are completed with an efficiency that contrasts dramatically with the emotional chaos that characterized the previous moments. The atmosphere in the courtroom cools. The tension dissipates, as if everyone suddenly remembers the final and irreversible nature of the act they have just witnessed. That same day, the body is transported by military helicopter to Al-Awya, Saddam's home village near Tikrit. The funeral ceremony is sober and limited. Tribal leaders, former Ba'athist officials, and family members gather around a simple tomb inside the mausoleum where Uday and Qusay are already laid to rest. There are no crowds or political speeches, only Islamic prayers and a silence steeped in history. The mourners show no open defiance, but many retain on their faces a mixture of mourning, family pride, and suppressed rage. However, the consequences of the execution go far beyond the physical moment of death. In Sunni neighborhoods of Baghdad and provinces like Anbar, the perception of sectarian humiliation fuels cycles of revenge that escalate into violence for years. The degrading nature of the execution becomes a symbol of Sunni victimization, which insurgent groups exploit to recruit fighters. The videos, played on mobile devices in cafes and mosques, fuel a narrative of martyrdom that contradicts that of justice. Between 2007 and 2011, Iraq experienced a spiral of sectarian violence, partly fueled by resentment generated by Saddam's execution. Radicalized Sunni groups, many formed by former Ba'athist army officers, channeled their humiliation into terrorist attacks against Shiite populations. The dictator's death, rather than healing national wounds, systematically deepened them. The gap between communities widened, and the still weak state was unable to articulate a common narrative that would unify the country. The most devastating historical irony emerges years later with the rise of the Islamic State. Many of its military leaders are former officers in Saddam's army, stripped of power and dignity after the 2003 invasion. The humiliation of their former supreme commander becomes further motivation for a revenge that will take forms more brutal than anything perpetrated during the Ba'athist regime. In their eagerness to avenge the past, they will create an even darker present. Between 2014 and 2017, ISIS controlled vast swathes of Iraqi and Syrian territory, implementing methods of terror that surpassed even Saddam's repressive standards. Filmed mass executions, systematic sexual slavery, destruction of cultural heritage. The executed dictator's legacy of brutality finds amplified expression in those who once served under him. History repeats itself, but more cruel, more global, more media-driven. And it all began in that concrete room at 6 a.m. with an open trapdoor. The dictator's death marks the end of an era, but also the beginning of another equally bloody one. In the ruins of Saddam Hussein's absolute power, even more destructive forces emerge, turning his brutal legacy into a prologue to greater tragedies. The final chapter of his story is written not with his death, but with the consequences that death unleashes on a nation that has yet to learn to live without tyranny.